It's a joy to have my friend, Father Patrick Edwards here, who is just the incarnation of so many parts of God's grace to me and to my family.
Oh, bless you.
And I don't want to say anything else, so he can jump right in. And Father, you need to finish what you want to say with us, really about 12 till. Yeah. See, he also likes to talk like I do, so this will be a wonderful learning opportunity for you, see. So,
great.
Without further ado.
Yeah, without further ado. Okay, just for laughs, and Charleston, I'm glad you're here to see this. When I first mentioned that I was going to be doing this, I was told that I had all of 30 minutes. Now I have all of 20 minutes. And that's either 30 minutes too short or 30 minutes too long, which means we don't even bother and try. What I'm going to try and do here is not just talk to you all about the history of Christianity and pandemics, because obviously we don't have time to do that. And partly I don't want to do anything that's going to make it sound like I'm trying to talk to you all.
You have to hold that way close.
I have to hold that way close. I'm
Yeah.
look like Elvis. Okay.
You kind of do favor Elvis.
I'm in the satin Elvis stage with big belly and things like that. So, okay. What I want to do is I want us to look at just 3 episodes in Christian history. One of these is referred to as the Antonine Plagues, very early in the Christian history. Another one is just to briefly look over the Mexican colonial period. And then lastly, to take it home to us in America, I want us to look at the plague that was the yellow fever in Memphis. If you know things about the church, you'll hear about the martyrs of Memphis. And I want to touch on those 3 as just something for us to be able to look at it. But like a historian, what I want to do is I want to look for examples and lessons for us today. Now, I want to just go ahead and say, why history? You've got some learned priests, but let me just spend a moment talking about this. As an historian, I don't see myself as just someone who studies the facts and the dates and the names and the battles of history. It's not just the narratives. I try to look at history for examples and lessons to teach me today about the decisions I can make, to find both positive and negative examples for me to be able to see trends that maybe we want to employ in my work now. Now I'm going to give you this one guy here, if you can see him, Henry Ford. You're going to remember the first part of his thing. History is more or less bunk. Henry Ford thought that everything we needed to do was just in the here and now. His idea was that whatever came in the past didn't matter to him. He wanted to invent things that are going to happen in the future. He was going to write history, not look at it. Now, a lot of people admire him, and if you haven't noted a lot about Henry Ford, it wasn't just about making cars and building assembly lines. This was a man who started an idea of social and economic systems that was called Fordism. Look that up on Google sometimes and read about it. This is a guy that wanted to invent a whole new way of society to be, and for him, that was all about going forward. He wasn't interested in what happened before. A lot of people think that's rather adolescent. And that's the person I tend to fly back to. Is I like George Santayana, and you'll recognize this one. Those who not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. Santayana is what I like to call a philosopher of history, and he was kind of one of my intellectual fathers. It was somebody who was trying to tell us that history is there, much like when you learn how to tie your shoelaces. Somebody had to show you, you looked at it, you learned from something else, and for him, history was like that. Otherwise, as he said, we stay perpetually adolescent. We always think we're the first ones to think of something, and we end up making all the mistakes again. So I love history for that reason, the idea of it being our long-term collective social memory. So with that in mind, I just want to say a little bit. My thesis for you today is that pandemics and social upheavals are times of great opportunity for the church, as long as the church rises to the challenge. And we begin by saying, I'm not sitting here like some sort of entrepreneur going, oh goody, we have a pandemic, a social crisis, now's the chance for us to make some hay. What I want you to understand instead is this is a golden opportunity for the church to just be itself. Because the world is finally awake to the need of something that the church can always offer with a lot of legitimacy about being who we really are. It's not a time to hide. It's not a time to put our bushel under a basket, our flame under a basket. It's our job now to let things come out to a world that really needs it now and is finally awake enough to know that there's something missing. So with that in mind, I want to go in here just very early. I'm not going to talk down St. Paul too much. But let's face it, prior to about 150, the church grew slowly and was very scattered. Now, if you read St. Paul, he was moving like a bat out of you-know-where. He was going from place to place, and he was always looking behind himself, trying to patch up problems because he was moving on to the next place. What's that?
Like a bat out of Wuhan.
Like a big old dirty bat from a wet market in Wuhan, yeah. And it was also pretty much stuck inside the pseudo-Jewish milieu. They were still in synagogues or hanging around the periphery in that area. Not a bad thing, but it hadn't grown into itself yet. And what happened inside of Rome, the Roman Empire, was called the Antonine Plague. It was probably one of the worst things to hit Rome. Probably the first time smallpox, because of international trade, ended up arriving inside the Roman Empire. And then there were, after the crisis began and there were lots of deaths, so you tended to have famines and decreased population, decreased sanitation. You began to have things like the measles and some other things coming along, just clobbering the people. Now, it's not just bad enough that they got hurt by that, but they also began to suffer with a loss of their institutions, both political and social, but also their religious institutions. People in the ancient Roman world used to spend a lot of time praying to the god of disease, fevera, okay? Wonderful word, fever, that we come from. And the idea was that if you prayed and made the right sacrifices, illness would stay away. It didn't work. And people were then beginning to question what to do next, and there was nothing in their system that was there to explain or support them in this crisis. There were no mechanisms for them to see themselves and how they could make their way through this, or to find value and importance of what was happening to them. They also were finding themselves with uncertainty and suffering, losing public trust. Does anyone feel like that may be happening anywhere around you? And I don't care which side of the political spectrum you are. People are losing trust in institutions that we have always thought were going to be there for over 200 years. And again, we're finding ourselves in a similar place. And with that happening, people are looking to each other. They can no longer count in my hometown on being able to get a burger. They may have to try and go and get groceries somewhere. And then, believe me, it looked like communist Russia in the worst days of the Cold War. We had to stand in line for a little bit of row of beans or something like that at one point. People were frightened, thinking that things weren't going to be able to come along. Families began to abandon their sick. They would put people outside their homes because they felt so hopeless and leave them isolated. And into this came along Christianity. First of all, Christianity began to care for the sick. Now, I want you to stay with me. I totally believe in masking, social distancing. For God's sakes, wash your hands and do all the things that we're taught to do to protect ourselves. But they stepped into the void because they saw people dying in the streets and they took care of them. And I mentioned inside here Julian the Apostate's complaint. This is a guy he was the nephew of Constantine. It was after Christianity had been introduced to the empire. He wanted to roll the clock back and make it pagan again. And his whole argument was, my God, will you pagan priests please get out there? Because the Christians is bad enough, they're taking care of their own people. They're taking care of our pagan people. So I want you to get out there and do things. And the pagan priests said, forget it. They hid from the danger. And as a result, Christianity was able to look like the people that was the answer for people suffering. They began to also take over food and monetary support. They reached into the void and they filled it. But they also gave a moral response that was so important. And it especially confound, here we are on All Saints' Day, fits into the mold. They were able to work with the stories first in the gospel, but they relied heavily on the stories about the saints. Because people found in the Christian saints examples and ideas. And when they looked at the martyrs, for instance, they were able to say, yeah, we're kind of in that place. We have to persevere against danger. We have to resist the despair and stay true. And so they saw for themselves symbols and examples that they felt they could live into, because they saw these people being put forward by the church, and they said, as we said in the song today, I want to be one too. I want to have what they have in the promise of the resurrection. Especially a couple here I just want to mention. Anthony of the Desert, not just because, as you see in this picture, if you were at the Halloween thing on Friday night, you saw this on the cover. Not only because he withstood privations, but it was believed he had the power to heal. And even in secular histories of this time, they have to deal with the reality that people thought that the power of Christ would be able to heal them. And this was something that we have to realize is part of our heritage. Martin of Tours, sharing with the poor, and any of the Book of Martyrs, like I've already mentioned, that people look to as examples of perseverance and winning the final victory. So just to say again, when it came time to fill voids, it was a protector from evil, illness, and death, a provider of social welfare, provider of justice and healing. Women began to come to the forefront like they hadn't before because of the situation that Christianity had always recognized women as leaders. But ultimately, and most importantly, what they did with authenticity of being Christians. Now, the next thing I want to pull up here is the evangelism of Mexico. I'm going to say very briefly, yes, the conquistadors were not nice people. They brought a terrible thing, including war, disease, that just decimated things. Conservative estimates from most historians will tell you that from 1492 until 1530, 80 to 90% of the population of Central and North America were decimated by disease. And remember, these are people who conveyed everything orally. You may have heard the Cherokees had a written language. That was a syllabic language that was only invented in the 19th century. Prior to that, everything was oral. If you lose 80 to 90% of your population to pandemic, the knowledge dies with them. So their civilizations too found these things to be terribly put together. The point I really want to draw from here, running out of time, is the importance for them that even though the first, the Dominicans, the Franciscans came and were very earnest and loving in the way they worked, it was the Jesuits. I got a lot of respect for them because the Jesuits were orchestrated and they were coordinated. You may not know this, but the Jesuits almost converted the Chinese court because they had worked their ways into them saying, you can keep this, we'll baptize that, we'll make that Christian. But then Rome came along and said, no, they have to change their ways, become little Italians. And that was lost to humanity. Imagine what we'd be like if we were celebrating a Catholic China today, like we have in the Philippines. Things might be very different. But they also use the narrative of the saints too, sometimes their own. And one thing I want to say very briefly about them is they baptize things. Now everyone knows tomorrow is All Souls Day, but if you have any Latin American friends or knowledge or exposure, you'll know it's also what? The Dia de Muertos, the Day of the Dead. And part of what was done by the Jesuits is they baptized, which say they Christianized the traditions that they found. So when they were looking for these opportunities and ways to fill voids, part of what they did was they would say, well, you know, you can remember your ancestors as well as other souls on the 2nd of November. And they did. And now in the Latin American world, it's probably the biggest festival all year long. And if you've seen the Disney movie Coco, you know what I mean. So this is something too they did. They began to try and emphasize things in such a way. Now I'm barely down here on time. Now I finally see my clock. I want to talk to you a little bit about our example. Our example is an American Anglican, Episcopal nuns. True story, we have them if you didn't know. We have monks too. And it was these nuns in the 19th century that when there was a terrible pandemic of yellow fever, very terrible disease, hemorrhagic fever, they went down when everybody else was trying to flee. What you can see are these numbers. And by the way, I want you to see that's a secular state trophy or one of those markers in Tennessee to commemorate them. And what it says here is an estimated 120,000 people caught the disease, 13 to 20,000 died. They didn't know what caused it. They thought that it might have been a poor sanitation. They were kind of right there. But I want you to understand, in these people, in these nuns and in these nurses, when everybody else fled, they went in. Now please, I wish I had time to read this to you. There's a letter that we have from one of those nuns, Constance herself, and one of the things that happens there is they're talking about how they would clean their homes and their hands, and they did what they thought was right and important about trying to stay safe. And they even complained that, you know, after they had sanitized their own home, in came the public sanitation people, and they poured carbolic acid and tar water all over their clean floors. But they resigned themselves to doing whatever they could to try and control the disease, but at the same time they were brave. Now this one's very personal to me because very early on in the pandemic, I began to write and speak about the martyrs of Memphis and saying, here's our turn, guys, we can get involved in this. And if this goes out on the internet, Father Lord Bishop Provenzano, you know how I feel. My bishop told us, I don't want any of you all being heroic. Don't you try and talk to me about the martyrs of Memphis. And we locked down from the middle of March all the way to the end of June. And I wasn't allowed to visit the hospital. I wasn't allowed to visit my parishioners. I was only allowed to call people on the telephone. And that was exactly the wrong thing to do. Because these people did what they did, and it sparked such a sense. Their faith was their example, and it drew people to them. They were incredibly, they kept the Lord's word. They weren't being reckless, but they were being brave about it. Now I got to tell you, some of them died, not because they were being reckless, because, my gosh, they thought that they were supposed to be controlling the dirt in the house, not the mosquitoes that were coming in from the lowlands. They just didn't know. On the other hand, they were so joyful. One of these great stories, I'll just paraphrase very quickly, that one of the women said, this is all the bad stuff that's happening, but you know what we can do now? We've got a key to the church. And we can go in and see the Blessed Sacrament anytime we want. And nobody can stop us. This was the joy for these people. And by the way, they came from Long Island. Just saying. But this is what they did. Despite the privations, their joy, their faith, fueled people in that city to endure. And by the way, when everybody that could get away did, the few that couldn't get away came out dedicated to the church. And St. Mary's Cathedral still stands there today, where they had a hospital. So what do I want to say here, just in closing? The things I would encourage all of you to do when you come together as a church is to ask yourselves, we're suffering the same way everybody was. We have a loss of institutions, the state, religion. What do people need? What are the voids that people need to fill? And it's easy for you to identify in your community. Where is it there are things that people are sad and sorry and are looking for something and they've seen it haven't worked, and know that the gospel in Christ can answer those. And then make that your job, to find ways as individuals and as a church to put that out, and to do it bravely, carefully, reasonably, not recklessly, but bravely, in such a way that can begin to reignite people's attachment to what they thought they could live without, which is the gospel and the church, and help them then to be able to see that there's something here. And I hear you have 100 people coming on board. Let me tell you, that's before the pandemic. And I want to say, what can you do now that the pandemic's going to wake up people? That's a blessing for us to imagine. I think about hope. I think about all the practical responses, community, justice, support, all the things we've heard from these places, but ultimately tell the story. Tell the story of the gospel, tell the story of the saints, and help people to see the priorities of life, away from all these things like entertainment and wealth and things they thought would protect them from disease and from the hopelessness. Let them see where hope is. Let them see where their priorities lie. So we're celebrating All Saints and All Souls today, my friends. I hope that I have not gone over my time or wasted yours. So I bless you all for being here. Thank you.